In this last video we'll link the optimization and the crashing. When we talk about optimization, what we're really meaning is we're looking at the optimum point in terms of resources and time. There's much broader ways of thinking about optimization, but we're just using that as a shorthand in this context. Again, looking at the slides, we'll go back. We'll step back to where we were just to see that we've got all our cost estimate done. Now we're moving into the optimization. Again, thinking back to the integrative case exercise that we did in class, you'll find that we've got a number of activities that we are actually crashing. This links back to the crashing examples that you will also find in the textbook. We have our task ID, we have our task chosen for crashing, normal costs, crash costs, normal time and crash time. Since this is a simulation exercise where you're making up the figures, it's just good for you to just pick a couple of examples that make sense. Probably somewhere around 10 activities to crash would be okay. Somewhere around that 7 to 10 is fine. Now what we see is that we've done the calculation where we've done our crash slope, and again we can see how we've done our crash slope in terms of normal cost, normal time, crash time. We've got the amount of duration, and then we have any additional cost. So the crash slope can actually be the cost per day. Simply multiply that out to give us the other figure. Now here we have to do a bit of imagination because we want to make sure that our crash slope, which is our daily cost, that some of them will be more and some of them will be less than our indirect cost. If they're all more, then we can't do anything, and if they're all less, we don't actually be able to produce the sort of graph that we would like to do. So it's just good to have a few that are lower, a few that are higher. We have to remember that in this assignment, part of what you're trying to do is demonstrate that you know how to deal with these sorts of issues. So you create data that makes it reasonably easy for you to demonstrate this. So we have our indirect cost per day with a bit of an argument provided on the previous sheet. And as we move across, we can actually see, we look at the indirect saving, total direct cost, and total amount actually saved. Again, we've got to think about this in terms of the daily rate actually saved. So again, this sort of, maybe another column might be put in, but this is pretty clear. Okay, critical path. Now, what we have to be careful of all the time with crashing is we can only crash a task that's actually on a critical path. Tasks can be crashed that aren't on the critical path, so it's perfectly okay to put one or two in that isn't on the critical path. That's just demonstrate a point, it's not a major point. As we start to crash, we actually realise that we may be actually changing our critical path, so this needs to be checked and clearly indicated that this is actually being checked. Again, going back, we can actually see that we've done this in order. 31, why is 31 being crashed? When we look at 31, we say, okay, 31 is being crashed first because the crash slope is 277, so why not 61? So I need to be able to get my logic on that because 61 is actually a lower amount. So why wouldn't we crash 61 first? So let's have a look to see if there's any logic for that. Yeah, so they've got the cost saving. So here if the cash slope is the cost savings overall as an aggregate is more, but the cost savings isn't more per day, and we actually we sort of crash per day. So I'm not too sure why they've chosen one over the other. So again, it's good, but again, a little bit perplexed about why they've necessarily done that. We're not expecting these to be perfect, but it's a little bit confusing at this stage. The logic is sort of okay. They've done 31, though I would again think if that's the lowest, we would have done that first, and that's the second. Again, what they've done is they've done it as all the days saved. Now, I can see why you would do this out of efficiency, but there's a logic problem, is that as you crash each activity, you may actually create another alternate paths. So that's why we like crashing it one day at a time rather than crashing them as bundles. So, so again, good, but a note to this effect that they've actually done this, and this is a shorthand of doing this, is okay. In effect, they will reach at exactly the same point, but the logic is not quite as tight as it could be, and that's why we do it per day. But what they've done is pretty good. As I said, we're not expecting perfection. No new activities appeared on the critical path, etc. So probably pretty sound. Initially I'd still be thinking that the 61 might be a better way of going, and would make more logical sense in how we actually crash. Now, looking at the tables, we can see that they've actually they've got 2 crash points, and then there should be a turn, but we've got 1 crash drop here, so I'm not too sure why there isn't a second point. So again, let me have a look at so this is the point before they've crashed, or have they put in the point before they actually did any crashing in the graph? My sense is they haven't done that, so it's probably good to say, well, you could put another point in, minor point, about the project before it's been crashed, and then you'd actually put the first crash point and the second crash point. That way we've got 1 and 2. Okay, that makes sense, because in effect it's already been crashed, and that's not actually shown in the graph. Good, but again, even a good one like this, there is always some points where a bit of clarity can be done. So generally the logic is fine. Again, this is why the working out matters. The working out's fine. A couple slight faults in the logic, I think, given that this is on the critical path. They're all on the critical path. That's the lower amount. That's what we do first. We will probably crash per day rather than crash by bundle. The logic problem is if you multiply them all out, you think that's the greater saving, so maybe that's the one we actually crash first. So I can see it. It's in practice it probably makes little difference, but it could create logic problems in other occasions, so that's why it's not quite as tight as it could be. This is excellent. They've done all the critical path comparison. They seem to have done this by, I think they've done this by crashing by bundles rather than necessarily crashing by day. They could just keep this and write a note saying that they did check this at a daily basis, or that there was no indication that it would make any difference on other activities, so that they've looked at it. I think in practice it won't. Okay, but just a note. Again, looking at the crash duration. What's the length of the project once it's been crashed, so therefore they've updated some of the other estimates that they've had here, and they've now got a slightly more detailed critical path, so calculated. People vote can be seen that the optimised, which is will be reduced by 6 days to 130 days. So that's good. So that's really good. Okay. The crash cost estimates, looking at these for a second, and again going back to the top. We look at again, we've got the direct labour costs. The labour costs have actually gone up. In many ways this would be calculated by the additional costs. So again, the logic of necessarily doing this, I'm not too sure. Consumables should be the same, so this should be pretty similar to what we would have got by simply combining the other factors, but I think the logic makes sense. So they've done the indirect costs again based on that's clever, that's good, that has value. So again, just sometimes it takes me a second to actually see what's being done. So this is overall good. It's well done. We can see the logic. They obviously got a good amount of logic, good linkage between the sheets. Again, using the phrase pernickety, but not probably correct, is that I think they didn't necessarily crash the cheapest. If you do it looking at days, we see we have one that was actually cheaper. Probably better to crash by day and constantly check that you haven't created an additional critical path, which is easy to do, but this is a high quality sheet, which is very clear and easy to follow. A good indication of a strong sheet is it's actually fairly easy to figure out where a mistake might be. Where a sheet that you can't understand, you won't see the mistake, you'll just see the number. So this is a good sheet to look at, and those additional points could be incorporated to improve your sheets if you want to use this as a worked example. Again, not perfect, but a very, very good example of a good, logical, well-formed sheet.